Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about how there could be a new wave of exciting Nintendo Switch 2 editions announced in an upcoming Nintendo Direct soon. Now we do have some updates in terms of the rumors surrounding this Nintendo Direct and also a rumor surrounding a Switch 2 edition, but I want to go beyond just these rumors. We will be discussing these rumors, but I want to talk about the Switch 2 editions that are to come on Switch 2, not just the ones that are already announced, but how there could be a new wave, when we might see them, and which games would be getting this treatment. It makes sense to think that there could be more Switch 2 editions when we consider what Nintendo had during the Switch 1 era. They had a lot of enhanced Wii U ports to really fill in the gaps of the Switch 1 lineup, and that was a big part of the Switch 1 success. The Switch 2 is off to a very great start sales-wise, but can it compete with Switch 1? Maybe if they continue with a strong, consistent lineup, and having Switch 2 editions may help to fill in the gaps very similarly to those enhanced Wii U ports. So what might those Switch 2 editions be, what will they entail, and when will we start to see more announcements on these Switch 2 editions? That's what I want to dive further into today. But if you've gotten to this point, let me take this moment to point out I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my content, your subscription would be appreciated. So here's an update on the Nintendo Direct situation. We already have a handful of sources saying that a Direct is supposed to happen in July, and by this point it seems like if that's truly going to happen, it would have to be in the last week of July. So here on Twitter, Timo had asked Nate the Hate, but a Direct is still happening in July? And Nate the Hate responds, to my knowledge. In the week prior, he had said he heard a Direct is happening in July, joining already a group of people who supposedly have inside sources saying a Direct is still happening in July. Now, some venues saw this and thought that Nate the Hate was doubling down on there being a Direct in July, and he clarified that he is not doubling down, only repeating what he said a week ago. Now, some people might interpret this as non-information, non-news, but I still think it's worthy of note, and let me explain. No, he's not doubling down, but he's also not changing his stance. He's also not including any updates suggesting there is a delay of any kind. And that's something to keep in mind here. We've heard in the past that Directs can be moved around a lot, and so with 1 week passing since he initially talked about there being a Direct in July, and him not having heard anything new, that would suggest that up to this point he hasn't heard about any delays, which is positive news for a Direct to still be happening in July. Now, nothing's guaranteed, still take this all with a grain of salt of course, but as we've talked about many times over the last few weeks, it just makes sense to think that a Nintendo Direct has to happen soon because guess what, Nintendo needs to continue making announcements about their games and their partner games coming to the console. So a few weeks ago, Nashville had talked about how there could be a new wave of enhancements and additions coming to Switch 2, and he talked about how there could be one for Pikmin 4. Now, he didn't deem this a leak express as he oftentimes does. He wasn't able to fully verify this one, so he's not placing as much confidence in there being some sort of improvement of Pikmin 4, but recently he's provided an update. He puts a little fire emoji. A multiplayer mode for Pikmin is being developed, much more complete and complex than what was seen in Pikmin 4. It will likely be in addition to the highly probable Nintendo Switch 2 edition, and will be able to play online via game chat. So the way this is seemingly being worded here, it does appear to be like there's more confidence behind this idea of Pikmin 4 being a Switch 2 edition, and I will say with Nash Weedle, he has a history of being correct, especially when it has to do with Switch 2 editions, because he talked about how there would be Switch 2 editions before that was announced, before other people had that idea, and he even had talked about there being a free edition of No Man's Sky well in advance before any of this was announced. And all that turned out to be true, so I'm more inclined to take this seriously than some of his other rumors that he has provided. But honing in on this idea of a Switch 2 edition of Pikmin 4, I do think it makes a lot of sense. One, I think there needs to be more Switch 2 editions announced, as we talked about earlier on, that Nintendo needs to fill in these gaps and further bolster the lineup of Switch 2 to continue that momentum so they can have a strong sales trajectory, and also that's more software sales on top of that. But Pikmin 4 reached a new level of sales success, it reached a new audience on Switch 1, and Nintendo likely wants to maintain this momentum for the Pikmin series and to continue to build on it. So offering a Switch 2 edition of Pikmin 4 will give it a little bit of a second wind, new life. Perhaps people who didn't pick up the game on Switch 1, who are waiting for Switch 2 or what have you, will pick it up now finally, and for those who already got Pikmin 4, maybe they will now get the upgrade pack And so I do think this would be a good business move for Nintendo for the series. But we've also heard about another rumor from Nash Weedle about there being a spin-off in the works for Pikmin. And so I wonder about this. Is it possible that maybe these two different things are one and the same? Could there have been some conflation here? Or are they two separate things? I would hope they are two separate things, because I think that would further help the Pikmin series if not only you have a Switch 2 edition with new content of Pikmin 4, but also a Pikmin spin-off in the works, both these things helping to tide fans over until the next Pikmin is ready, Pikmin 5. And I'll just point out, I do not think we're going to have to wait as long for Pikmin 5 as we waited for Pikmin 4 after Pikmin 3. I think Nintendo has struck a really strong formula of success with Pikmin 4, and I do think they want to build on that, and if they have things like a Switch 2 edition, a spin-off to maintain momentum in the meanwhile, that would be great. Now maybe we don't need both a spin-off and a Switch 2 edition of Pikmin 4, but regardless of what's actually happening, I do think it makes sense to maintain the momentum of Pikmin and to keep it coming. Now, on this idea of it being some sort of expanded multiplayer mode as new content in a Switch 2 edition of this game, I will say while I 100%ed all of the single player content in Pikmin 4, I didn't do any multiplayer with this game. So if they want to add online multiplayer with game chat features and an expanded new multiplayer, maybe where it's like a Dandori with several parties involved, not just one versus another, I could get in on that. Now, I would prefer to have some new single-player content, but if this rumor does turn out to be true, I will reserve my judgments until I see what this new multiplayer mode is. Regardless, I would love to see Pikmin 4 with enhanced visuals. I think this game running at a higher resolution with some minor visual optimizations, running at a higher frame rate, 60 FPS, would do so much for this game. But I would probably like some new content, so I'm more likely to revisit this game, because visual enhancements alone might not be enough for me unless this is a free upgrade for Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack members like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Now, something that I think should be pointed out here, this rumor of this Pikmin 4 enhancement isn't talking about how it's going to be announced in the next Nintendo Direct. Maybe it will, maybe a little bit of a ways later down the road. There's no clarification on when this would be announced. And considering that we still haven't gotten all of the initial Switch 2 editions that were announced with the first Switch 2 Direct, I would not assume we're going to get the same amount of Switch 2 editions announced in this next Direct. I feel like with Switch 2 editions, you don't need to announce them that far in advance. So this next wave of Switch 2 editions, if there is to be another wave, and I think there will be, maybe it won't be 6 Switch 2 editions announced in one Direct, maybe 2 or 3, and that's just something that happens in a new Nintendo Direct every 4 months or so. But what other Switch 2 editions could there be? Well, one Switch 2 edition that I think is going to happen, but I'm not sure would happen in this next Nintendo Direct, is a Switch 2 edition for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I've already done a dedicated video on the idea, but the basic concept behind it is that we may be years away before the next brand new Smash Bros. Game. Currently, Sakurai is working on Kirby Air Riders, and with Smash Ultimate, it was such a big accomplishment, it may be very hard to just follow that up and improve upon it. So instead, they may wait many years, work on Smash Bros. For a long time, and go at it from a slightly new angle. Perhaps somewhat similar to how they handled Mario Kart World. They took a long time to move on to the next actual installment of Mario Kart, that was Mario Kart World, and it's a bit of a departure from the rest of the series, with that whole massive continuous world hook. But in the meanwhile, while we waited for Mario Kart World, we got the Booster Course Pass where they added a whole bunch of new content to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Maybe they could do something similar for Smash Bros. Here with a Switch 2 edition. A Switch 2 edition that includes improved visuals, improved performance, perhaps also improved online, and new content. Maybe a new mode, perhaps a Fires Pass Volume 3 with new characters and stages. I think that would probably be the best outcome. And something like this conceivably could be announced in the next Nintendo Direct, but I feel like with the lineup we have so far for 2025, they wouldn't need to announce a Switch 2 edition of Smash Bros. For this year, but maybe save it for next year. I'm not saying there wouldn't be any other new Switch 2 editions announced for this year, but Smash Bros. Feels like a really big one that they would save for another time. But what kinds of Switch 2 editions would make sense to be announced in a Nintendo Direct perhaps next week? Well, here's one. Switch 2 editions for Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3, somewhat similar to how they announced Switch 2 editions for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Maybe even these could be free through Nintendo's online expansion pack. Not every Switch 2 edition will be free, but maybe something like these could be. Because these games already have expanded DLC, I don't think it would make sense to add new content to these particular games. I don't think Monolith would be spending time working on adding new content to these games. But visual improvements, having a higher, more stable frame rate and resolution, would greatly benefit these games, more so than the improvements we saw for Breath and Tears, because Xenoblade had a lot of ambitious things going on, so there had to be a lot of compromises in terms of resolution, and these games were only running at 30 frames per second, so seeing Xenoblade running at a higher resolution with some other minor enhancements at 60 FPS can make for a huge difference. So these being cheaper Switch 2 editions, like Breath and Tears, would make a lot of sense. And oh, by the way, some of you may be wondering, well, what about Xenoblade Chronicles X? That game just came out. It seems like it would make more sense to just offer a free enhancement of Xenoblade Chronicles X on Switch 2. Higher resolution, higher frame rate, very similar to a lot of the other free enhancements we've seen for Switch 1 titles on Switch 2. Which, by the way, let me just skim through those real quick here to have them fresh in our minds. Because when we take a look at these like ARMS, Captain Toad, Game Builder Garage, the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Splatoon 3, which is more recently announced, some Mario games, some Zelda games, these games I do not think will ever be getting a Switch 2 edition. They've already gotten enhancements that are for free, so I think when thinking about other possible Switch 2 editions, we can very easily exclude these as possibilities. And I think this really helps us to shorten the list of possible Switch 2 editions we could see throughout the Switch 2 era. But I also think it should be noted, it seems likely that there will also be cases where Nintendo just does a free enhancement for certain games, like I just mentioned maybe for Xenoblade Chronicles X. So I consider games like Rhythm Heaven and Tomodachi Life. These are games that were recently announced in the March Nintendo Direct for Switch 1. They're coming out next year. They are Switch 1 titles, but I would be surprised if there wasn't some sort of Switch 2 enhancement. Will there be Switch 2 editions of these games, or will there simply be free updates? I think it's interesting that we got these games announced, and in the following Switch 2 Direct, they were not mentioned at all in terms of getting improvements for Switch 2. But these games are coming out in 2026, and all these Switch 2 editions Nintendo talked about were for 2025. So it's possible one of these games, if not both, do get Switch 2 editions. I'm going to lean in the direction of Rhythm Heaven just getting a free enhancement for Switch 2 running at a higher resolution. And Tomodachi Life I'm a little bit split on, because I know Tomodachi Life has a lot of sales potential, so they may want to position it as having a Switch 2 edition as well. So they may want to position that one as having a Switch 2 edition so it can have more legs on Switch 2 moving forward. So if I had to guess, I'm going to say that maybe even in the next Nintendo Direct we'll see a little bit more on Tomodachi Life, and they might give us a more clearer release window than just 2026. Maybe they'll say something like spring 2026, and they might even announce that it's going to have a Switch 2 edition. Now, recently we talked about how Dr.81, a fellow content creator, made a discovery on the LinkedIn profiles that someone had recently finished working with Nintendo on a sequel of an SRPG for Nintendo Switch 2, which has a lot of us thinking that that has something to do with Fire Emblem, which then may suggest that Fire Emblem, whatever is the next Fire Emblem, is almost done. There have been rumors that there would be a remake coming to Switch 1 for years, but it's been such a long time, I do think we should perhaps raise the question, is this actually happening? I know some of these rumors came from Nate the Hate, and he's also talked about a Kirby Planet Robot, and these things haven't been announced yet. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't coming. A lot of times when we're talking about things that have been heard from behind the scenes, we don't know when they're actually coming out. Think about this, Donkey Kong Bonanza. We've been talking about a Donkey Kong game being made by the Mario Odyssey team, likely being a 3D Donkey Kong game. At least I've been thinking it's been likely throughout pretty much the entire Switch 1 era, since 2018, and it was true. That rumor was legitimate, but it took them until the launch of Switch 2, July 2025, for this game to come out. So just because these rumors haven't proved to be true yet doesn't mean they won't eventually be proven to be true. Sometimes projects just take longer to be announced for whatever reason, perhaps they pivot or something like that. And on the note of pivoting, maybe the reason why we haven't heard about this Fire Emblem remake yet is because they pivoted to making it a Switch 2 exclusive. Similar to maybe Donkey Kong Bonanza. We had heard rumors of Donkey Kong Bonanza years in advance, right? But what we've recently learned is that they actually started development of Donkey Kong Bonanza on Switch 1, and midway through they transitioned over to making it a Switch 2 project. So it's possible the same thing has happened for this Fire Emblem game. Now, it's also possible this Fire Emblem sequel is separate from a Fire Emblem remake. They may be two different things. But either way, I am leaning in the direction that if we are to get another Fire Emblem, it may just be an exclusive and not have a Switch 2 edition. But I mention it here because I've talked about that possibility before, that this long-rumored Fire Emblem remake might be announced as having a Switch 2 edition, but still comes to Switch 1 as well. But there do need to still be some Switch 1 games coming. We should keep that in mind. even though lately Nintendo has been clearly mostly focused on just supporting Switch 2. Now, another game that I expect to get a Switch 2 edition is Bayonetta 3. Bayonetta 3 actually runs a little bit better on Switch 2 because it has an unlocked frame rate, and the game's always trying to hit 60, but it rarely actually hits it on Switch 1. However, on Switch 2, it almost always hits 60 frames per second. But they haven't actually gone ahead and made enhancements for Bayonetta 3 on Switch 2, so I think they will, and I think in this case, they will actually give it a Switch 2 edition so it can have a second life and improve on its sales. And on that note, I would expect that Bayonetta 1 and 2 might even see some free enhancements as well. Now, another game series I could see getting a Switch 2 edition is actually Mario Rabbids Sparks of Hope. Ubisoft has talked about how they found the sales of Mario Rabbids Sparks of Hope disappointing on Switch 1, and so they might actually be very eager to provide a second life to this game on Switch 2 with a Switch 2 edition. So I've talked about a variety of Switch 2 editions in this video. The ones that I think we could see be announced in the next Nintendo Direct would be the Xenoblade ones, and maybe Tomodachi Life, possibly also Bayonetta 3. As for the others like Smash Bros, Pikmin 4, I think they're very likely, but I'm not so confident they would be in this next Nintendo Direct. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart, thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.